going to say something, or should I just jump into it? Okay, fine. If you could a little bit, that'd be good. Great. I'm all set. Yeah, it'll be a little while. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Peña, and it's a pleasure to be here at the Pera Museum. I was formerly the program director of the Film Society of Lincoln Center and the director of the New York Film Festival. I did that for 25 years, and I stepped down from that this past December 31st. And I am currently, and have been for a number of years, a professor of film studies at Columbia University. And I am also on the jury of the Istanbul Independent Film Festival, which is what brings me back to Istanbul this time. A city I love very much, so I'm delighted to be here. And I was asked to offer a talk on in American independent cinema, so I'm going to try and sketch out, in the time that I have, a very brief history of what I think are some interesting moments in this, excuse me, very broad and I think often misunderstood movement, and show you some clips from some films which I think are of great importance, and then we'll take it from there, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about things at the end. Okay, oops, old computer, so it takes the time to get settled in a new climb. When speaking of an American independent cinema, what exactly are we talking about? A cinema that's independent of what? Does the notion of an independent cinema necessarily imply the existence of some version of a dependent cinema? And what precisely would that be like? This discussion might seem hopelessly academic, but in fact, in contemporary discussions of film, I don't think there's another term more abused than independent cinema. Once used to describe a series of actual movements, today, the use of the term seems more like a kind of advertising strategy and offered to the public to savor some kind of forbidden fruit usually denied audiences. In fact, today, just about anybody could describe themselves as an independent filmmaker. For all intents and purposes, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas are independents, if being independent simply means being able to make whatever one wants to make. The first appearance of the term independent with regards to American cinema actually dates back to about 1910, the year that Thomas Alva Edison launched the Patents Trust. Edison, you'll recall, or at least his company, was one of the pioneers of motion picture technology. He, in fact, believed he owned the rights to all motion picture technology and thus all films made by everybody, everywhere. And to enforce this, he created what became known as the Patents Trust, a small group of companies that he licensed to make, distribute, and exhibit films while forbidding everyone else to work in the field. Now, this might sound crazy, but Edison was a very wealthy and powerful man. He drove many people out of the business who feared lawsuits as well as his hired thugs. But a group of feisty film producers refused to bow to his will. They were known as, you guessed it, the independents, and they sued the Patents Trust for what we call in America restraint of trade. A lower court in 1913 decided in their favor, and while Edison continued to pursue his case, members of the trust began to defect, and the whole thing fell apart by 1915. Among the leaders of these anti-Edison independents were two men who would become leaders in Hollywood later. Adolf Zucker, whose famous Players would turn into Paramount Pictures in 1914, and Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal Pictures. As the American film industry moved from a small-time artisanal operation into a major industry, smaller companies began to merge or be bought up by larger companies, until by 1930, that is, by the dawn of the sound era, the industry was essentially controlled by just 8 companies. 5 majors, they are MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO, and 3 minors, Columbia, Universal, and United Artists. Together, these, excuse me, Together, these 8 corporations made about 70% of all American feature films from 1920 to 1950, but they garnered about 95% of all the profits generated by the industry. These film studios, as these corporations came to be known, were in economic terms vertically integrated. They owned or controlled every aspect of the film business, from owning contracts for the services of key artistic personnel to constructing and operating their own movie theaters. Certainly, it's easier to imagine the existence of possible independent cinemas faced with such a reality. And in a few minutes, we'll see some examples of independent films from the studio era. Besides controlling the industrial and commercial side of American cinema, the studios were also responsible for promoting a certain approach to filmmaking that has become known as the classical Hollywood narrative style. Elements of that style, which of course had a powerful influence internationally, include the use of clear, linear narration to tell stories, strong, goal-oriented protagonists, temporal continuity, spatial contiguity, and generic codes and formats. Other, more openly ideological aspects of this style include heterosexual bonding and a kind of rugged individualism. Although this version of the studio system no longer exists, its demise never led to an automatic opening up of the market for new films and filmmakers. Over the years, the vertical integration of the studio era has been replaced with other, less apparent, but no less powerful forms of control over production, distribution, and exhibition. Before I begin a more detailed discussion of major moments within the tradition of American independent cinema, let me outline the major structural factors that go into defining the experience of independence. First, production. Production refers to the 2 separate but clearly interconnected categories of finance and technology. At the heart of the American independent film experience has always been the experience of self-finance, especially up until the last 2 decades. Few filmmakers have ever expected to support themselves through their filmmaking. They taught at universities or other places, or worked commercial jobs to support their more personal work. There are also stories of those who did things like mortgage their houses, crash their cars, and did other things I won't go into here. Especially for political documentaries made in the 1930s and 40s, unions and other political groups were often possible sources for funds. In 1955, the filmmaker Maya Deren began the Creative Film Foundation to channel grants to avant-garde filmmakers, and soon after, other foundations opened themselves up to proposals from filmmakers alongside other visual artists. In the mid-60s, the National Endowment for the Arts was created, and soon after, various state art councils, as well as public television stations. So for the first time, governmental funding became available to support independent cinema. By the late 70s, there was also a certain amount of support for American independence coming from European television stations or from European or other international private film producers. Coinciding with the impressive success of a number of American independent films released in the early 1990s, exemplified by Sex, Lies, and Videotape and Roger and Me, private investment began looking to independent films. For many of us, this development has had decidedly mixed results, often forcing the films to be more predictable and formulaic, hardly distinguishable from the mainstream Hollywood movies from which they're supposed to provide an alternative. But more on this later. The ability to make films is, of course, dependent on having access to the equipment to create them. Throughout the silent era, access to film equipment was highly restricted. The first consumer cameras only came out in 1924. With the transition from silent to sound cinema from 1926 to 1928, professional film producers began to dump onto markets old cameras, as these cameras were either too noisy or moved at variable speeds. They were quickly snatched up by a generation of artists eager to make their own films. Similarly, in the aftermath of World War II, the U.S. Army dumped hundreds of spring-driven Bell and Howell cameras designed for combat shooting onto the market, which, again, were eagerly acquired by a new generation of aspiring independents. Improvements in 16mm technology for TV news gathering helped launch a wave of independent filmmakers in the 1960s. And of course, in recent times, first the video and then the digital revolutions have led to veritable explosions of new work. Among the trajectories one could follow in the history of cinema would be one showing a progressive democratization of the means of filmmaking, so that today virtually any adult could make his or her own film. Distribution and exhibition. As I mentioned previously, the Hollywood studios were vertically integrated businesses. They not only created products, but they controlled how, when, and where these products, these films, reached the consumers or audience. Thus, a Paramount film would be distributed by Paramount and would be shown in many cases in a Paramount movie theater. In those areas in which a studio did not have its own theaters, it would have a contract with a local exhibitor or would swap exhibition rights with another studio for later consideration in some of its own movie theaters. This arrangement proved enormously profitable to the studios, so much so that by the mid-40s, they began to curtail production levels to concentrate their energies elsewhere. Yet the end was near. In a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case, Republic versus Paramount, the Supreme Court ruled that the vertical integration of the American film industry constituted a kind of restraint of trade and thus was illegal, and ordered the studios to sell off their exhibition and distribution chains within 5 years, leading to the subsequent collapse of the studio system. One might have imagined that this would have signaled a victory for American independent filmmakers, but in truth, actually, it had little effect on them, as since the beginning, independents have been forced to create their own alternative venues and formats for reaching the public. The first venues to welcome independent films were the numerous film clubs that had grown up in the 1920s to show foreign, principally Soviet films. More often than not, these clubs had a political orientation and were often allied, at least informally, with labor unions, with union halls often serving as screening rooms. College campuses also provided ready venues for these clubs, as did occasionally churches or synagogues. In 1946, Maya Deren, a filmmaker who had been living in Los Angeles, rented the Provincetown Playhouse on McDougal Street in New York City and presented screenings of 3 of her independently made films. The show proved so successful that Deren rented the space for 2 additional weekends. Moreover, news of the screenings encouraged many filmmakers, who had until then been largely working in isolation, to emerge and find ways to show their own work. All this activity led in 1947 to the creation of Cinema 16, a weekly film club at first dedicated to independent filmmaking and later a distribution service for independent films. Cinema 16 and a handful of other organizations greatly increased the visibility of independent filmmaking throughout the U.S. Other venues for independent films were created with the rise of museum, university, and other nonprofit film programs. By 1970, just about every major art museum boasted some kind of film program, and the vast majority were dedicated almost exclusively to independent cinema. A key element in the growth of these programs was the increased availability of public funding, which helped not only to create the works, but also to support their exhibition. The past 2 decades have witnessed a precipitous decline in the so-called art cinema sector of theatrical exhibition. About 60% of the business that a specialized film, the preferred term nowadays, that encompasses both independent films and foreign language films, makes in the U.S. will be in New York City. And even those films that do make it to successful theatrical runs tend to be the better financed independents, featuring recognized stars and having the promotional efforts behind them of a major company, such as Weinstein or Sony. Television initially seemed a promising venue for independent cinema, especially for the early cinema verite documentaries of the 1960s, but that soon changed. By and large, unless an independent film has won incredible fame and enjoyed tremendous success or features well-known stars, its chances for television sales are fairly small. The situation on public television is somewhat better, but there are just too many films and too few slots. Finally, VHS, DVD, and now internet distribution have each sparked hope as promising platforms for independent films. But while they have certainly increased access to films, they've rarely provided much in the way of profits for producers. And finally, film form and ideology. The existence of an alternatively produced, distributed, and exhibited American cinema clearly implies a kind of dissatisfaction with the products of Hollywood. Independent films exist, one might surmise, because independent filmmakers believe that they can offer audiences something that Hollywood films cannot. It might be a greater range of possible forms of cinematic expression that might be allowed within the confines of classical Hollywood narrative style, or it might be the treatment of certain subjects deemed too risky, controversial, or otherwise uncommercial by Hollywood standards, or some combination of the two. Independent filmmakers can be shown to have attacked, questioned, or subverted just about every aspect of classical Hollywood style and its prevailing ideology. One area of frequent concern was storytelling. Classic Hollywood films are essentially machines for telling stories, detailing a problem, exploring through the agency of a protagonist possible solutions to that problem, and then finally solving it. Independent filmmakers often mistrusted the story and at times seemed to abandon it altogether, substituting documentary reportage or moving towards complete abstraction of the images. Alternatively, some independents have tried to make storytelling problematic by presenting fractured, incomplete, or enigmatic narratives which defy the easy linearity of the classical model. Similarly, it was through the independent cinema that subjects such as large-scale unemployment, race relations, or sexual identity could finally be addressed. Often, independent films paved the way for subsequent discussions of these same topics within mainstream Hollywood movies. And now I'd like to talk about 4 examples and show you 4 examples of works that for me embody movements and moments in the American independent cinema. The first I'd like to discuss are the film and photo leagues. Although there had been isolated examples of works by individual filmmakers since the very earliest days of the cinema, the first example of an American independent film movement were the film and photo leagues that emerged in the 1930s. The first, founded in New York in 1930 as the Workers' Film and Photo League, the Workers was later dropped, it brought together a loose collection of filmmakers, photographers, writers, critics, and performers. Within a few years, there were 11 affiliated branches throughout the United States. By late 1930, the effects of the October 1929 stock market crash were being felt with full force across America. Unemployment levels reached record highs as factories and businesses were forced to shut down or reduce operations. Insufficient relief efforts led to strikes and often violent confrontations with the police. Yet little of this was to be found in the mainstream media. The newspapers, which were overwhelmingly Republican and conservative, played down the crisis with frequent announcement that things would soon get better. Hollywood, basking in the enormous profits reaped by the first talkies and musicals, was in little mood to burden the public with unpleasant realities. It was to combat this media blackout of the Depression that the film and photo leagues were founded. League members took as their subjects all those things considered too controversial for the mainstream media: strikes, riots, breadlines, the setting up of Hoovervilles or tent cities by unemployed workers, etc. Almost all filming was done with silent 35mm equipment, as the price for such equipment had collapsed as a result of the introduction of sound cinema in the late 20s. Screenings of League films were held in union halls, social clubs, university campuses, and even outside in the open air. As the films were silent, most screenings featured a live narrator, often one of the filmmakers, who would point out important details and afterwards lead discussions. This last point is essential, for these discussions and the subsequent education and organizing that went with them helped to establish the League screenings were for their audiences fundamentally different experiences than simply going to the movies. Attendance came to symbolize a kind of commitment, a willingness to look for alternatives. Initial funding for the League came from the Workers' International Relief, a cultural and social service agency. But as League branches spread around the country, new sources of funding, mainly from unions, were found. A distribution network was set up so that footage might be exchanged between branches. A workers' newsreel was made up of a compilation of material from the various branches, and at times was even shown in some commercial cinemas. The newsreel, of course, was the dominant aesthetic form of League production. Filmmakers sought to present reality as they found it. The difference with studio-produced newsreels, such as Fox Movie Tone or the Hearst newsreels, was one of focus. League films sought to present a side of America glaringly absent from the mainstream view. Because so many were locally produced, League films often emphasized local problems and personalities. They sought to reveal the lives of everyday Americans, not simply the rich and famous. A key influence on many of the League films was the Soviet cinema of the 20s, and many of their published manifestos recalled the language of their Soviet colleagues. Working under the guiding principles of montage, or the juxtaposition of shots, League films constructed their arguments to lead viewers to precise political conclusions. A typical example is the Detroit League's 1932 Ford Massacre. The film begins with shots of the miserable conditions of workers and their families, many of whom had been out of work for over a year. Despite bone-chilling temperatures, they decide to organize a march to demand some kind of assistance. Meanwhile, plans for the march alternate with shots of the Detroit police joining up with the Ford Company's hired guards. When the marchers approach the plant, a riot ensues and 4 marchers are killed. A title card tells us they asked for food and they got bullets. The film emphasizes how the workers, even when engaged in peaceful, legal protest, are victims of a law that sides too often with the rich and powerful. In America Today, another League film, protests against the arrival of the first New York consul general from Nazi Germany are intercut with demonstrations demanding justice for the Scottsboro Boys, a group of young African-American men who were falsely accused of rape. Thus, the film tries to show that anti-fascism and anti-racism are connected struggles. Now I'd like to present my first sequence, an example of a film that I think represents much of what was interesting about the work of the Film and Photo Leagues. The film is called A Bronx Morning and was made in 1931 by J. Lida. The film is a portrait of what was at the time, and probably still is, the poorest, humblest part of New York City, the Bronx. While it does certainly contain images related to the then current economic crisis, the film is perhaps more properly seen as a kind of celebration of an America never seen on Hollywood screens. A working class America, filled with people going off to jobs, kids playing in the street, people shopping in local stores. If you know the Soviet cinema of the period, you'll certainly feel its influence, and also that of another kind of film that straddled the border between documentary and avant-garde work. The City Symphony, the creation of a kind of city portrait along the lines of a kind of musical composition. Only if in Europe the model was usually, orchestral, here Lida uses the much looser rhythms of jazz. The music that you'll hear, though, was only added recently. Let's watch, if we can, that first clip. Jay Lida was from the Midwest, and he came to New York in 1929 to work as an assistant for the great American photographer Ralph Steiner. He lived in a tiny apartment in the Bronx, and the film is a kind of homage to his neighbors and his neighborhood. Lida wanted to study filmmaking in the Soviet Union with his hero, Sergei Eisenstein, but wasn't accepted into the directing program, only for the one in film production. Undaunted, Lida went to Moscow and showed Eisenstein A Bronx Morning and was then admitted as a director. Years later, Lida would be the translator and editor for the first volumes of Eisenstein's writings in English. He would also be a founder of the Cinema Studies Department at NYU. In addition to producing films and organizing screenings, the leagues were also active in film culture, often including foreign film in their program and offering classes in filmmaking, photography, and even film appreciation. From the New York film branch came Filmfront, perhaps the finest American film magazine of the time. Each issue featured news of league activities, reviews of current films, and often translations of articles by major European writers on film. Now I'd like to turn to talk to you about the American avant-garde and its beginnings. A thorough discussion of the rise and development of the American avant-garde cinema, alternatively known as the American experimental cinema, would be a wonderful subject for a totally separate presentation. Yet there are many ways that this movement can, I believe, be profitably compared to that of the film and photo leagues in the 30s, as well as to later groups of independents. Although one can find, as early as the 1920s, examples of avant-garde works such as Sheeler and Strand's Manhattan or Watson and Weber's Lot and Sodom, the traditionally accepted starting point for the avant-garde movement is the 1943 production of Meshes of the Afternoon by Maya Deren and Alexander Hammond. The extraordinary impact of this work on later generations of filmmakers, as well as Deren's own role as a tireless promoter of independent cinema, cannot be overestimated. Moreover, the collaboration between Deren and her then-husband Hamid would be curiously symbolic of the movement in total. Hamid, a Czech émigré, brought a familiarity with the European avant-garde and had in fact been part of his own native country's avant-garde before arriving in the U.S. Deren, a dancer and dance critic historian, looked to the cinema as expanding aspects of the medium in which she was most familiar. In Meshes, as well as in her own later work, Deren would expand into bold explorations of consciousness, as well as the possibilities for movement within cinema. As with the film and photo leagues, one could say that the beginnings of the avant-garde cinema in the 40s stemmed from a deep dissatisfaction with the limitations of the dominant Hollywood cinema. For Deren and others of her filmmaking generation, who included Kenneth Anger, Curtis Harrington, James Broughton, and others, the classical Hollywood style, with its demands for clear storytelling, had made it almost impossible for innovative artists with truly personal approaches to the medium to emerge or to work. Witness the isolation and scorn suffered by von Sternberg, von Stroheim, or Orson Welles. Beyond the stylistic constraint were the well-known limitations on subject matter as prescribed by the infamous Hollywood Production Code, which forbade discussions of subjects ranging from suicide to homosexuality to drug addiction, and even made married couples sleep in separate beds. The films of this first generation of avant-garde filmmakers would see as their goal the creation of a truly personal cinema to stand in opposition to what they saw as the industrial cinema of Hollywood. The first avant-garde films exemplified what the film historian P. Adam Sidney has called the trance film, a kind of film that seemed descended from the figure of the sleepwalker in the German silent classic The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In the trance films, the protagonist, almost always played by the filmmaker him or herself, wanders through a dreamlike landscape, searching for something that's never made clear. Deren and Hammer's Meshes of the Afternoon, in many ways, established the template for the trance film. Let's have a look at this second film. Years ago, I showed this film in Damascus, in Syria, and the first question in the Q&A was, what was the reason for having a Shiite woman in the film? So, couldn't answer that one, actually. Okay. In Meshes, Darren and Hamid, who are the woman and man who we see in the film, create an enigmatic story that seems to exist somewhere between dream and reality. Curiously, many of the most powerful effects generated are accomplished not by simply ignoring the rules and convention of classic Hollywood filmmaking, but by following them. Take, for example, the famous moment where the bug-eyed Maya rises from the table with a knife in her hand. She starts getting up in the dining room, but completes her trajectory in a field. As she starts to walk, she steps on sand, dirt, grass, concrete, and finally carpet, all perfectly edited. Yet, of course, such a passage through space is impossible. Rather than moving forward in time, as we normally do, in classical narrative, Meshes is always circling back. We try to create a sense of development, but finally the film remains simply too enigmatic. What's left is not a story, but a feeling, one that remains with you no matter how often you see it. As I mentioned earlier, Maya Deren, soon after her return to New York in 1946, became a great promoter of this new cinema, and thanks to her efforts, especially avant-garde filmmaking, became a presence on the American cultural landscape. It's for those reasons, as well as for her own contributions as an artist, that the American Film Institute named its awards for those individuals who have made the greatest contributions to American independent cinema, the Maya Deren Award. The avant-garde cinema, like that of the Film and Photo Leagues, never really tried to enter into the commercial movie houses. And again, just like the League, it created its own institutions for film distribution, such as the Filmmakers Co-op and Canyon Cinema. In time, practically every major city, or every city with a large university, would have some kind of program or place dedicated to avant-garde cinema. Avant-garde cinema would also be seen in museums and even art galleries. Although there were many magazines that focused on avant-garde cinema, by far the most important was Film Culture, founded and edited by filmmaker Jonas Mekas. While the Film and Photo Leagues disappeared by the late 1930s, the avant-garde continues, even if its activities and influence barely extends today beyond New York, San Francisco, and a handful of other cities. I'd now like to turn to the New Left cinema of the 1960s. We'll skip a couple of decades and jump to the 1960s to an independent movement that I'll call the New Left cinema. This is a movement that really exploded onto the American scene in the late 1960s, very much linked to the political turmoil going on in the US at that time. The roots of the movement, though, go somewhat deeper. The first factor to consider for the emergence of this New Left cinema was the continuing improvement of 16 millimeter technology. As I'm sure you all know, 35 millimeter has been the accepted professional gauge for filmmaking since about 1904, although it's fast disappearing due to digital filmmaking. 16 millimeter was developed for amateur filmmaking in the 1920s, and thus there were excuse me. Sorry. And thus, there were very limited film stocks available in that format. But after World War II, American television arrived seemingly overnight, and with it, television news. It was soon obvious that TV news could be captured faster and a whole lot cheaper using 16 millimeter. So immediately Kodak started improving 16 millimeter stocks, offering as wide a range, even wider, than they offered in 35 millimeter. Simultaneously, 16 millimeter cameras were greatly professionalized and adapted for synchronous sound recording using magnetic recording tape. While all these changes were made principally for television, they were quickly taken up by a new generation of documentary filmmakers, artists such as Richard Leacock, D.A. Pennebaker, Albert Maysles, Ed Pincus, and many others. Another factor in the emergence of the New Left cinema was the growth of university film departments. In the 1950s and 1960s, we witnessed a greatest expansion of higher education in America's history. 4 times the number of people were enrolled in college in 1960 as had been in 1920. With the expansion of higher education came also the expansion of the kinds of course offerings there. And by the mid-1960s, courses in filmmaking and increasingly in film studies could be found from community colleges to the most exclusive Ivy League universities. These courses gave access to film equipment and editing facilities to an unprecedented number of aspiring filmmakers, putting filmmaking within reach of more Americans than ever before. Universities also became prime exhibition venues for many of the films created by this New Left cinema. Finally, the final and perhaps defining factor for the emergence of the New Left cinema were, of course, the fervid political movements of the time. This New Left cinema was in many ways an outgrowth and a response to the old left cinema of the Film and Photo Leagues. That cinema had been primarily a response to the conditions of the Great Depression, and its strongest source of support and its primary audience was the American working class, working or otherwise. In contrast, the New Left cinema, formed politically under the twin crucibles of the civil rights movement and the protest movement against the Vietnam War, was largely university-based. College students, or young people in general, were the primary audience for the films. But as in the case of the Film and Photo Leagues, the impetus behind the movement was to get out the truth, the real story about what was happening down south or in American cities or what was happening in Vietnam. Television told, at best, only part of the story, and Hollywood generally avoided anything considered controversial. The New Left cinema would fill the gap with films that offered different analyses and different images. For example, Troublemakers, an early example of this New Left cinema, was made in 1965 and focuses on attempts to organize the poor, largely African-American inhabitants of inner-city Newark, New Jersey. The making of the film, in fact, was part of the organizing process. The film became a way for the poor, whose voices are usually kept out of the media, to express their thoughts about their everyday lives. Robert Manchever and Norbert Fruchter, who made Troublemakers, would go on to be founding members of Newsreel, a New York-based organization that clearly took the Film and Photo Leagues as its model. Newsreel's first major work, Columbia in Revolt, documented and analyzed the student takeover of university buildings in May 1968. The film was shown widely across the U.S. and served as an effective counter-propaganda tool to the news broadcast depictions of the students as irresponsible hoodlums. Besides all the techniques familiar from cinema verite documentaries, New Left films would also make extensive use of archival footage, often deconstructing images and texts found in the mainstream media, or putting them in a new context. In The Murder of Fred Hampton, a 1971 film by Mike Gray and Howard Alk, what began as a portrait of the charismatic Chicago Black Panther leader became an investigation into his death after he was killed by Chicago police halfway through the shooting. By contrasting official pronouncements about the shooting with physical evidence from the scene, showing, for example, that it would have been impossible for Hampton to have been the first to have opened fire, the film details the collusion of the media and the government officials eager to cover up the facts of the case. Most of the films of the New Left cinema were privately financed, occasionally with donations from well-known figures on the American left, such as Paul Newman or Leonard Bernstein. Yet it's important to remember how widely shown many of these films were. Especially as the protest movements grew, it was not at all unusual to find auditoriums and college campuses, standing room only, completely packed for screenings of movies such as Emile d'Antonio's In the Year of the Pig, one of the most powerful films made about the Vietnam War. Now I'd like to show you a sequence from that film, In the Year of the Pig, made in 1969. Third sequence, please.
Been waiting for. This is the one you've all been saying to yourself, what this company needs is a good fight. By the grace of God, we're going to get it. From there, we're going to S&D, search and destroy, the thing you guys like. Okay. Some of you, I know this is going to be a shock to you, but it's a switch for old Alpha Group. We're riding in. And we're not riding in on one of those dusty old APCs. We're going in first class. TWA, Teeny Weeny Airlines.
Well, search and destroy is an attempt to, as the first word would indicate, to find the enemy, to search out where he would be, and then to destroy him in his habitat.
Okay!
West of the stream and east of the road. Roger.
Race you think is actually in there?
Geez, I don't know, about 20 tons, 10 tons.
How far back does it go?
It's about 30 by 15. Anyway, it's about 12 feet deep.
How do you destroy this much rice?
Yeah, the demo man usually blows it up.
You're going to blow it up, are you?
If I can't get it out there, I'll blow it up. It's unmilled rice.
Here's all the detachment consists of. 2 double-rotor Chinook helicopters. The Chinooks usually are cargo or troop carriers, but not these. They're gunships.
The prisoners that we've captured or have been captured say that this is the most feared weapon outside the B-52s. That is because the amount of ammunition we carry, the very type of weapons, and the amount of time we can stay on station. At the present time, we have on this a 140mm grenade launcher, 2 20mm cannon, 5 50 caliber machine guns, and 2 rocket launcher pods consisting of 19 2.75 rockets. We usually carry inside 2 additional M60 machine guns and ammunition for them. And occasionally the crew rat holes a few things that they don't tell us about until we're airborne. If we work at it, we can unload in about 20 to 25 minutes. But we are in danger of burning out barrels, which we frequently do. I was amazed when I came to this outfit of how accurate the 50 calibers were. I figured they would be known more of an area spray weapon, but they can actually walk those weapons right down the tree line. Now the 20mm is of course very, very accurate and has quite a range. We can start firing with this machine 4,000 meters away, which is considerable distance. The one I fly is known as birth control. You enjoy your work. Why?
Well, I've been doing it for 36 months since I've been in the service, and it's the type of work I enjoy outside, moving around.
But this particular operation, the Cedar Falls, why are you enjoying this?
Well, I think we're benefited by clearing all this area. It's the first time you've got a push on like this and hadn't walked off and left it. They're completely just going right ahead and pushing on forward instead of walking off.
Where'd you find these people?
They live right in this area here in the village of Donglin, between here and the railroad out to the west.
Why'd you bring them in here?
We've had so much trouble when we moved through this area. There have been a lot of civilians killed as a result of this, and as we made our pass through here, we picked these people up and moved them with us into here so that we could make a careful sweep and probe each and every hut looking for tunnels and caves, possible VC hiding places. We found a few caves and blew them, picked up some weapons, killed a few VC. In the meantime, we're now going to sweep back through and go to the railroad and move back out to the west.
What's going to happen to the people tonight?
Well, the people, we're going to keep them right here. We've got some chow farm and some water, and we'll feed them, and you'll be surprised how they can take care of themselves here with a minimum of resources. And, they take care of these children here during the night. They huddle real close together, and they'll keep warm.
Now, how long are you going to hold on to these people?
Well, around noon tomorrow as we move back out to the west. And then these people will be released to go back to their own huts to cultivate their rice or harvest their rice and continue their normal activity.
Now, you got some VC suspects out of this group, didn't you?
Yes, we just held lifted 5 suspects out of here back to the battalion rear CP to be further interrogated.
How did you select them?
These Chuhoi people and Vietnamese interpreters that we have with us, they've been in this area 2 or 3 years, and they know these people, and from talking to them, they get some ideas. Maybe these people know a little more than they're telling us, and we take them back to get a little higher echelon of interrogation down Hoi An or in Bonn. Some of these people come back to us even, and we'll put them with our companies to sweep these riverbanks. It's hard to know just who a VC is unless he's carrying a weapon or a cartridge belt or some grenades or something. A person just walking along, you don't know if he's a VC or not, might be in this crowd. But then some of these people that have operated with a VC, and if they defect and come over, and we can use these people as scouts, and they go along the riverbanks with us, and they look just like anybody else. But when they have a weapon, then they're free game.
The war in Vietnam was a war against the land of Vietnam. The idea of blowing up 10 or 20 tons of rice for people who clearly, needed such things, or just the amount of material that we were unleashing against the forest, or seeing those bulldozers knocking down those trees, really gave a different view of what was actually going on during the war in terms of the permanent damage, or some of the damage we were doing to that country. In terms of distribution, Newsreel handled its own distribution. Other important sources included the Tricontinental Film Center and Haymarket. Probably the two most important critical journals were Cineast and Jump Cut. With the American defeat in Vietnam, militant political activism on campuses and elsewhere all but disappeared. The communities that had provided such enthusiastic support for the New Left cinema, and to an extent for the avant-garde as well, seemed to disappear by the mid-1970s. The New Left cinema filmmakers responded in two ways: by moving into the historical documentary, which sought to create alternative American history by focusing on those generally left out of traditional American history, workers, women, gays and lesbians, native peoples, etc., and towards fiction, which brings us into our final section, the return of the independent fiction feature. The title for this last section is a bit inaccurate, as one would have to admit that the independently produced fiction feature never really went away. By the late 1940s, a number of Hollywood filmmakers had formed their own production companies, even if they continued to work for distribution and exhibition through the studios. The actor, for example, Ida Lupino, together with her then-husband Collier Young, made some remarkable films that dealt with subjects ranging from rape to unwanted pregnancy to bigamy for her company Filmmakers. John Cassavetes' Shadows seemed to signal in 1959 a cinematic revolution, an American new wave that, sadly, never really got going. Although there were continued interesting work in fiction, most of the attention in the 60s and early 70s was paid to documentaries, especially those that were linked to political movements. That began to change by the mid to late 70s as more and more independents turned their energies towards creating fiction. One all too brief but very rich crop of works in this feature revival is nowadays known by the improbable title of the LA Rebellion. The LA Rebellion refers to the efforts of a group of young African-American filmmakers, Charles Burnett, Julie Dash, Arthur Jaffe, Ayoka Chinzira, Billy Woodbury, Larry Clark, and a handful of others, to create a new black independent cinema. Almost all of them had been students in the film department at UCLA, and for a number of years they managed to stay together, working on each other's films in various capacities. Again, the inspiration for the movement was a somewhat negative one. Beginning in the late 60s, Hollywood had unleashed a new genre of violent urban crime films that earned the nickname blaxploitation films. These were films that were designed for the large crowds of young African Americans and Latino men who were about the only ones who still ventured into the big downtown movie palaces in New York, Chicago, or LA. Almost always written, produced, and directed by whites, these blaxploitation films continue to have their defenders, but at least for the generation of the LA Rebellion, they seem like the antithesis of the black cinema they dreamed of creating. It's not that they wanted to offer some kind of idyllic version of contemporary African-American life. Far from it. They wanted to capture all the pain, all the hurt, all the moments of joy and pleasure. They wanted to take the skills they learned and admired in cinema verite documentaries and apply them to fictional tales set in the communities in which they lived. I want to show you now a sequence from one of those films, the film that you could call the Citizen Kane of the LA Rebellion, if you will, Charles Burnett's Killer of Sheep, a film first screened in 1978. For me, Killer of Sheep is easily among the 10 greatest American films made in the past 50 years, a work of such beauty, of incredible subtlety and depth that it hurts me that a film as great as this never received proper distribution until just a few years ago. But let's watch the clip. The film tells the story of Stan, a man who works in a slaughterhouse, who's doing all he can to just keep it together. But between his dehumanizing work, the deterioration of his neighborhood. The film was shot in Watts, the section of Los Angeles that suffered very violent riots in the late 1960s, that of course is known today as one of the homes of gangster rap. And the characters he sees around him, you're not sure how long Stan can hold on. In the sequence you're going to see, Stan has agreed to accompany a friend of his to buy a car motor that's being kept in the living room of a neighbor's house. Let's watch.
Who beat you up?
None of your damn business.
And off the boulevard jumped on me.
Hey, what's happening?
What's happening, old dude?
Hey, who's been working on you?
Adolph and Boulevard kicked his ass.
Who kicked him in the face?
You know,
What did you do that for?
you didn't have nothing else to do with his hands and his feet, nigga.
Yeah, he kicked your ass for being so smart, huh?
Wait till I get on my feet.
Just going outside.
Okay, baby.
How come you're not going to school? I guess it's it. You're going to fall behind.
Can you play that?
Oh, Jim.
See what you said?
All I got is $10. I told you. What is this, a damn regular size show?
I'm not just a man, such a silly ass family as this.
I mean, you ain't never got together.
What would you do?
I wouldn't know what position to take, Mom.
You dirty dog. You gotta find yourself a place to stay instead of sponging off my sister.
This my uncle's house, too.
Please. But tell this nigga to shut up then.
All I got is 15. Don't sell him nothing, Uncle, here. Nothing.
Hey, man, won't you be cool?
You know, you would be a good looking fella if you didn't frown so much.
Who, me?
Some sister told me I would give back to our gave.
You about as tasteless as a carrot.
You always in old nasty frame of mind.
Just a regular hardship case. Someone always trying to revive your poor ass or give you first aid. Always feeling sorry for yourself.
If I don't, nobody else will. You just an all-day sucker bitch. You don't know that! See, she can't come up to you over here, man. See, man. Come on over here, man. Let's sit by him.
I've got more important things to do. My hair's falling out.
Say, man, you please. Why'd you have to kick the son of a bitch in his damn head? Silver, you better come over here and see about your nephew.
Can't you see I don't give a damn? You shouldn't run his damn mouth so much. Give me $15 for the motor and his shirt for collateral and it'd be slick.
That's actually what you mean. You can cut it.
No.
As I mentioned, when Killer of Sheep came out, it was never picked up for distribution. It was shown at a few festivals and museums and then pretty much disappeared, except in the hearts and occasional writings of a fervent cult of its admirers. Happily, in 2003, Milestone, one of our more adventurous distributors, restored the film with the help of the UCLA archive and released it on DVD. It also arranged for it to have a few limited theatrical runs in several cities, which turned out to be surprisingly successful. Perhaps Killer of Sheep was, oops, somehow, sorry, skip some pages here. Sorry. Perhaps Killer of Sheep was simply too early. The great wave of American independence that would emerge after the growth of Sundance was still almost 15 years away. But somehow I don't think that wave was ever for films like Killer of Sheep. When American independent cinema suddenly became hot, it was because the mainstream media finally got the independent cinema that it wanted, not that we wanted or needed. The idea of a cinema that in any way was an alternative or even just a parallel to that of Hollywood was pretty much dead. Nowadays, independent films are either cheaper versions of Hollywood movies or auditions to get jobs in Hollywood, or both. Of course, every year there are a few films that remind one of what independent cinema was supposed to be. And of course, not all these phony independent films produced by Sony or Weinstein are bad. But I miss that thrill of otherness, that sense of seeing what someone doesn't want me to see or hearing what I'm not supposed to hear that only a truly independent film can offer. Which is why I guess I spend most of my time looking at foreign films. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about independent film or any of the films I tried to introduce. Yes.
Bir saniye. Pardon, bir dakika, mikrofon getireceğim çeviri için.
Oh, I guess we have a mic. Come here.
Sorry for the translation. We need the mic. Okay. Thank you. I know you briefly touched on how support of independence increased over the past 8 or 9 decades, with not only monetarily with foundations, but also with the general public, with independent movie theaters, and also, you said, public TV. But I'm curious to know how it is nowadays. I mean, you kind of closed with saying it's not as big, but how do you view it presently? Is it still, I don't know.
Well, I think the one thing that's happened, that's really changed since, say, 1990 is that independent cinema has become a business.
Right.
You know, prior to that, you know, it was never really a business. I mean, people made them, and some films, especially, say, some of the New Left films, actually made some money just because they were widely seen, but no one really went into it as a business. Now they do. You know, now there are certain films. Again, you know, the numbers are, how could you say, if you really look at them, they're disheartening. I mean, if every year something like 1,000, you know, American independent films, feature films are made, you know, probably more, you know, more if you consider documentaries, but let's just go at feature films, and say of that, let's say 200 get some kind of festival play between Sundance and South by Southwest and the others, and of that, let's say 30 get distribution of one sort or another, and of that, you know, 10 get significant release, and of that 5 make money. That's a good year.
Would you say the best avenue is then universities, or how would...
You know, I don't think there is an avenue. I mean, I think basically there really isn't a way, and I think these films continue, you know, basically to be made and sort of to not really amortize themselves, but people, you know, it's a dream for people. You know, there are so many stories of people, you know, mortgaging their houses and doing all kinds of things. I remember when I saw the Blair Witch Project, I saw it, you know, months before it came out, and just thinking, you know, this is going to launch 1 million films. You know, hundreds of thousands of people are going to make a film saying, you know, I can make this. You know, and that's always, I think, been the history of American independence. As soon as one film makes a lot of money, that sort of inspires many other people to go into it. But the truth of the matter is very, very few make any money. You know, small number break even, but the vast number of them lose money.
Right.
You know.
Okay. Thank you. All right.
Thank you for that. I have two questions that are about the same era, actually. The 20s was really fascinating. I didn't know much about the leagues. How were the Soviet films imported? I'm sort of assuming they weren't imported commercially by the studios or anything. Did the leagues also take on this duty as the importation, the distributor?
Right, they came in. Right, they came in often through the leagues. The Workers' International Relief Committee was often the agent for a lot of the films. They came in. So often, a lot of the first screenings of films from the Soviet Union. I mean, I think the first Soviet film to be seen widely in the United States, as in most of the world, was Battleship Potemkin. And that opened in New York in 1926, and soon after that, a number of other films, you know, also came in. But especially, you know, leagues and other groups that were associated with it became very principal venues for those films, and you know, and also some university groups. So that's how Soviet cinema really became known in the U.S.
And the second part of that question is you talked about how there will be a narrator and then discuss the film, and of course all of this brings to mind the third cinema. It's like basically the manifesto.
Absolutely.
Is there an influence there, or are they just both inspired by the Soviets?
Well, I mean, again, it's not really, the Soviets didn't really have that model. I think it's a fascinating parallel, and I'm glad you bring it up. I'm not really sure that the third cinema people knew that. I think what both of them saw was that you have to change the screening act into a political act, that you have to, you know, make it so that people know that when they're going to the movies, they're just not going to the movies. They're, you know, they're taking part in a political action just by going to the movies. So I think that's what ties them in common, you know. Whether or not, you know, again, Solanas Nahitino and other people like that were aware of the leagues, I don't think so. But I mean, who knows? You know, maybe they had some awareness of them, you know, because, you know, when the New Left cinema came around, there were still a few people who were veterans of the leagues around, like Leo Hurwitz and people like that, and they were always carted out as heroes because they had been doing stuff like this from the 30s, you know. But I don't think there was a direct connection. But I think a lot of it was to just say, you know, we're going to transform what going to the movies means.
Başka sorusu olan? No more questions, I think, then. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you. Pleasure. Hi.